This week, I've gone back to working on the crab frogman monsters and the cave that they dwell in. So I was forced to think about how the layout of this cave would look, as opposed to the relatively straightforward design of the town. It made sense that the cave wouldn't just be a direct line from point A to point B, but rather a maze-like layout with dead ends and whatnot. But this leaves us with a problem. Mazes give rise to unfun situations. Well, maybe a better way of putting it would be mazes can create unfun situations. The initial feeling of being lost and having options as to where you can go is exciting, but there is a fine line before you cross into frustration, or worse, just boredom. So how does a game developer allow the player to keep the feeling of free choice that a maze initially brings, and control the player subtly enough to stop them from getting too lost and not having fun? Here's 3 ideas to do exactly that. Number 1, make subconscious signs in the environment that direct the player. So, in this cave I've made, at first the tiles were pretty samey, the floor tiles. But you could make a slightly off-color floor tile and use it to direct players subconsciously. So, in this cave, say this slightly purple-ish stained dirt isn't as immersion breaking as, say, an arrow pointing the player around. It just looks more like a natural part of the environment, but it can be used as a kind of path. Also, I have this pillar in the middle of this room. It forces the player to either go up to get around it or down to get around it, which both happen to be viable paths to progress the cave. You can go around the other side of it, but this doesn't really help. Number 2, use enemies to push the player where you want them. When you enter the cave, you don't have a way to fight the frog crab monsters. You can evade them, and if there are too many, well, you're forced to retreat or you die. This means that even though the player could go up or down from this room, up results in being overwhelmed and forced back down because there's too many enemies. This is basically the equivalent of a dead end, but not really, because later on in the cave, the player unlocks the ability to shoot back at the enemies that get in your way. So really, this wall of enemies is the equivalent of a gate that needs a key. But whereas if I had literally made a gate here with a lock on it, the player's thoughts would be, oh, I need to find the key. And when they do find the key, they know they can go back, but it feels more like they fulfilled an obligation. The way I've done it, with the unsurpassable amount of enemies, it allows for a different train of thought for the player. At first they think, I can't go this way, it's not an option. Allowing for an epiphany later on when they realise they can go that direction with their newfound powers. This is much more fun in my opinion, and it does just as good a job at indirectly directing the player to where they need to go. Number 3, make it feel like there are more options than there really are. Really, what's fun about being lost in a maze? It isn't that there's actually a lot of ways you can go. It's that it feels like there's a lot of different ways you could go. In the entirety of my cave, there's only 3 rooms where there's a branching choice as to which new room you could go into. That's not really that many. It does, however, feel like there's a lot more ways you can go, on account of how often you decide how you get around obstacles. For example, in this room, there's really only 2 ways out. The way you came in, and the way at the bottom that I want the player to go. However, since the player can only see a small amount of the room at a time, and they're choosing how they get around obstacles and enemies, it does feel like there's a lot of different ways you could go. The reality is the player's being funneled to exactly where I want them to be. So that's my 3 ideas for things you can do to control the player without directly controlling them. Like and subscribe!